Good evening. My name is David Bell and I'm the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Reading. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to our annual Albert Wolters public lecture hosted by the University's School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences. This is the third annual Albert Wolters lecture named in honour of Professor Albert Wolters, who was appointed as the first lecturer in psychology at the University of Reading in 1908. We are, of course, delighted to have as our guest speaker Professor Noam Chomsky, who will deliver tonight's lecture in a moment. While our Head of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences, Professor Laurie Butler, will have the honour and pleasure of formally introducing Professor Chomsky, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome him warmly on behalf of the University of Reading and, of course, the town of Reading. Before I hand over to Professor Butler, I'd like to say that we are filming and live streaming Professor Chomsky's lecture, and we want that to be of benefit to those who were unable to secure a ticket to be here in the hall. The camera will only focus on Professor Chomsky, however, and will not film the audience. I would now like to invite Professor Laurie Butler onto the stage to say a few words.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and a warm welcome to you all. It truly is an enormous honour to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky as our 2017 Albert Wolters Visiting Professor. We award this title annually to internationally distinguished scholars in recognition of their world-class contribution to psychology, linguistics, and neuroscience. As the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, this title is an honour of our very first lecturer in psychology, Albert Wolters, who was fondly remembered as a true pioneer of his discipline, both within the University of Reading and on a national stage where he served as president of the British Psychological Society. It's fitting, therefore, that tonight we recognise another true pioneer, one that is both known for his groundbreaking contributions to linguistics and psychology and also for his political commentary. Born into a Jewish family in Philadelphia in 1928, Noam Chomsky quickly began to shine. When Noam was 10 years old, he wrote an editorial for his school newspaper lamenting the fall of Barcelona in the Spanish Civil War and the rise of fascism in Europe. His research then was so meticulous that it formed the basis of a publication several decades later. At 13, he would travel alone by train to New York, reading voraciously and formulating the ideas which would later underpin his political beliefs. At 16, Noam entered the University of Pennsylvania, meeting the linguist Zelig Harris, one of the founders of structural linguistics, where he completed both his bachelor's and master's degrees. Noam continued at the university to complete his PhD in linguistics in 1955, during which he also spent time at Harvard shaping his ideas about language learning. In 1955, Noam accepted a position at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Within a few years, he was a full professor and still retains the title of Emeritus Professor of Linguistics to this day. Over 6 decades, Noam, with his colleagues and students, simply revolutionized the field of linguistics. As well as his seminal work, Syntactic Structures, Noam has published dozens of books and many papers. Famously, Noam's 1959 review of verbal behaviour by B.F. Skinner came to be regarded as the definitive rejection of behaviourist accounts of language learning, that idea that learning is based purely on reinforcement. Instead, Noam argued, in a theory that has now survived into its 6th decade, that the brain has an innately determined blueprint to the general structure of language, explaining the apparent ease with which children can understand words and phrases without having been explicitly taught them. By any standards, this is an astonishing career, especially for a man who modestly said that MIT hired him and gave him tenure because it does not care much about the humanities. It simply needed to fill a slot. Notwithstanding his protestations, Noam is arguably the most important linguist alive today, or indeed of any time. His reputation, of course, transcends well beyond academia. Bono of the band U2 referred to Noam as the Elvis of academia. Praise indeed. Noam has also had the good fortune, or possibly the ill fortune, to be interviewed by the spoof presenter, Ali G, who, when asked how many words does you know and what is some of them, coolly explained how many words the average Westerner knows, and then, as requested, what is some of them. Noam, of course, is not just an extraordinarily influential linguist, but also a political activist and social critic. In a wonderful quote, Noam summed up his worldview as, "Whatever the establishment is, I'm against it." Over the years, he has published numerous books and talked widely on issues ranging from US foreign policy, democracy, terrorism, and the Middle East. The journalist John Horgan once asked Noam what he found more satisfying, his political work or his linguistic research. Noam replied that he spoke out against injustice merely out of a sense of duty. He took no intellectual pleasure from it. If the world's problems suddenly disappeared, he would happily, joyfully devote himself to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Alas, the world's problems remain all too real. However, Noam is a powerful reminder to us all of the importance of speaking out and a much-needed antidote to the rather depressing undercurrent of anti-intellectualism that pervaded last year's UK referendum. So this brings me on to Noam's talk. Since Noam gave us his title last year, it does feel as though the world's events have been falling over themselves to provide him with even more material. As you would expect from one of the great thinkers of our time, his talk will be engaging, challenging, and hugely, hugely thought-provoking. So without further ado, please put your hands together to welcome onto the stage Professor Noam Chomsky.
Hi. You wanted to speak from the lectern. Oh, shall I start off? Okay. I knew something was going to happen, but I wasn't sure quite what. For some time, I've been intrigued by an interesting debate that took place between astrophysicist Carl Sagan and biologist Ernst Mayr. They were debating the likelihood of finding extraterrestrial intelligence. And Sagan, arguing from the point of view of an astrophysicist, calculated the number of planets more or less like Earth and concluded that it's very likely that there should be intelligent life. And Mayr, arguing from the point of view of a biologist, took a different tack. He said, we have one example, Earth. Earth has had many species, maybe as many as 50 billion, he calculated. So we have plenty of evidence about what leads to biological success. And he said the conclusions are pretty clear. The successful organisms are those that, very simple ones, that mutate very quickly, bacteria, or those that have a fixed niche which they just stick to through thick and thin, like beetles. And as you move up the scale of what we call intelligence, biological success declines. And when you get to the very top, that's us, it's extremely recent. If an asteroid had hit the Earth a couple 100,000 years ago, then in all the billions of life on Earth, there would have been nothing that we call intelligent life. So his conclusion is that the history of life on Earth refutes the claim that it is better to be smart than stupid. And he points out on the side that the average lifespan of a species is about 100,000 years. Modern humans emerged about 200,000 years ago. And modern humans are now engaged in a dedicated effort to establish Mayer's thesis. That's an enterprise that's been underway since the end of World War II. During this period, human intelligence has succeeded in conjuring up a virtual perfect storm. It's created two huge sledgehammers poised to destroy us, while systematically eroding the most important line of defense against self-destruction, with particular dedication in the past generation. The two awesome challenges to survival, decent survival, are of course nuclear weapons and environmental catastrophe. And the best defense would be functioning democracy, in which informed and engaged citizens join together to develop means to overcome the threats, as can be done. In crucial ways, policy making throughout this era has been designed to enhance the threats, has undermined functioning democracy by excluding the population from participation, in fact, even awareness. And these dangerous tendencies have been significantly enhanced by the socioeconomic policies of the past generation, the neoliberal era. These policies have, as you know, sharply concentrated wealth, hence political power. They've undermined institutions that might be responsive to the public will. They're well designed to diminish functioning democracy, with consequences that are all too evident before us over much of the world, dramatically right now in the West. So it's as if the species were determined to prove that Ernst Mayer's thesis is correct, that intelligence is a kind of lethal mutation, and that we've perhaps outlived our allotted time on Earth. So what I'd like to do is to try to bring together various strands of recent history that intertwine, I think, to show that the picture of a perfect storm is all too plausible. So let's go back to the end of World War II. It was clearly one of the most important dates of human history. It was a moment of joy, also of horror, with the dawn of the nuclear age. Actually, I can remember well my own feelings on August 6th when the grim news was announced, relief that the hideous war was over, horror at the way it ended, and astonishment that very few people seemed to care about the enormity of what had just happened, or the fact that we had now entered what may well be the final era of human existence, the nuclear age, in which human intelligence has created the means for terminal destruction. It was not understood at the time, but the end of World War II also signaled the beginning of another era that threatens organized human existence, the so-called Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which human activity is dramatically changing the environment. There have been debates about its inception. The World Geological Society recently settled on roughly 1950, partly because of radioactive elements dispersed through the planet by nuclear bomb tests and other consequences of human action, including the very sharp inflection, the sharp increase of greenhouse emissions. So the nuclear age and the Anthropocene pretty much coincide. And one index of the severity of the crises that we've lived through during these two eras is provided graphically by the famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Every year, a group of distinguished scientists, political analysts, meet to try to evaluate the state of the world and to determine how close we are to terminal disaster, which would be midnight on the clock. The clock was first set in 1947, 7 minutes to midnight. In 1953, it got to 2 minutes to midnight. That was the point at which the United States and Russia exploded hydrogen bombs. That's the closest it's been since. It's oscillated since. In 2015 and 2016, it was moved to 3 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it had been since the early 1980s, when there was a major war scare. The reasons for advancing the clock were, I'll quote them, the mounting threat of nuclear war, and the failure to deal with climate change, which had not been considered before. So what they said is the probability of global catastrophe is very high, and the actions needed to reduce the risks of disaster must be taken very soon. That was 2016. Actually, that earlier brush with terminal disaster merits attention. I'll come back to it. It tells us a good bit about policy making and the nature of Western democracy. Well, that was 2016. At the outset of the Trump term, late January, the analysts met again and reset the clock. They moved the hand closer to midnight, and the reason, in their words, is that they found the danger to be even greater, the need for action more urgent. It is 2.5 minutes to midnight. The clock is ticking. Global danger looms. That's the closest to terminal disaster since 1953. Well, going back to 1953, the closest to terminal disaster, there's an obvious question. Was it avoidable? And what efforts were made to avoid it? The answer is pretty startling and fraught with grim lessons for today. So let's have a look. 1950, the United States was remarkably secure. It controlled the hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, had overwhelming economic and military superiority, largely controlled the major industrial states. They had been severely weakened or virtually destroyed during the war, while the American economy boomed. Industrial production quadrupled. The United States, long before, had been by far the largest economy in the world, unusual advantages, but it had not been a major player in world affairs. That role had been ceded to Britain, secondarily to France. But the war left the United States in a position of overwhelming power, actually with no historical precedent. The United States was indeed remarkably secure, but there was one threat at that time, a potential threat, ICBMs, which would, of course, have nuclear warheads. They didn't exist, but they surely would exist. There's a standard scholarly work on the history of strategic weapons written by McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, former Harvard Dean. he was given access to all relevant declassified materials. And the book, his history is quite interesting, in particular for one sentence, which is sort of there in the middle without comment. Bundy says, speaking of the circumstances I've just described, he says, "I'm aware of no serious contemporary proposal in or out of government that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement." Actually, that seems to me one of the most remarkable and revealing statements in historical scholarship, as is what it describes, namely that there was apparently no thought of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, and not a small threat, the threat of utter destruction. Security of the population was a very marginal concern, even security from instant destruction. Rather, the institutional imperatives of state power prevailed to such an extent that the possibility of avoiding utter destruction was never even considered. Furthermore, the potential victims, the population, were left completely in the dark. They still are. Though all of this is public, of course, it's quite unknown. Well, let's look a little further. Were there possibilities? Well, we can't be sure. There were apparent opportunities, but they were ignored, and they're pretty interesting. So in 1952, Stalin made a pretty remarkable offer. He offered to allow Germany to be unified on the condition that it not join NATO, even with the prospect of elections, which of course the communists were sure to lose. This was discussed by one eminent political analyst, highly regarded political analyst, James Warburg, wrote an important book about it called Germany, Key to Peace. He was simply ridiculed, and the possibility was completely ignored. Well, the Russian archives have been released since, and it turns out that Stalin might have been serious. The bitterly anti-communist Soviet scholar, Harvard, Adam Ulam, he takes the status, I'll quote him, "The status of Stalin's proposal is an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and American security that would have been enormous?" One of the most prominent Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, writes that scholars who have studied released Soviet archives were surprised to discover that Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and to improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia, opportunities that were squandered in favor of securing German participation in NATO. Well, was any of this real? Can't be sure, of course. What we can be sure of is that what mattered was global power and not security for the irrelevant and uninformed population. Actually, that's one of the starkest and most consistent lessons of policy formation. When you look closely, you find that though there's a lot of talk of security, of course, it's not security of the population, which is at most a marginal concern. Rather, it's security of systems of power, state and private. It's too large a topic to review in detail, but let's carry it a little bit forward into the 50s and 60s. A couple of years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev took over in Russia. He was committed to trying to raise the economic and social conditions of Russia, which of course were far behind the West. And he realized that that's impossible to do in the context of a continuing arms race with a much more powerful West, including the United States. So he therefore made an offer to carry out joint reduction of weapon systems. And when the United States did not respond, he unilaterally reduced Russian offensive weapons quite considerably. The offer was made to John F. Kennedy, and here's what happened. I'll quote the late Kenneth Waltz, one of the leading international relations specialists. He writes that the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world had yet seen, even as Khrushchev was trying to carry through a major reduction in conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimal deterrence. And we did so even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, same conclusion. The Kennedy decision, harmed national security while enhancing state power. And again, what happened was largely concealed, and indeed remains concealed behind the enthusiastic rhetoric of the Camelot years, largely remains so. Well, the import of Kennedy's decision was revealed starkly in October 1962. What Kennedy advisor, American historian Arthur Schlesinger, called the most dangerous moment in history, Cuban Missile Crisis. And the facts are harrowing. Turns out we now know that President Eisenhower had subdelegated authority to use nuclear weapons to commanders. Actually, Dan Ellsberg has a forthcoming book with lots of details about this based on his experience as a very high-level analyst studying these topics at RAND. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, nuclear-armed B-52s were constantly flying all over the world, the so-called Chrome Dome exercises. Chrome Dome pilots have reported that individual bomber crews could have launched nukes, ending human existence. And the details of what happened in that crisis, which have been very well studied, we have an extensive documentary record, they are pretty remarkable. They merit close consideration. They bear directly on the issue I'm now discussing. On October 26th, the peak of the crisis, there was, when it looked as if there might be war, which would be terminal war, a letter arrived to Kennedy from Khrushchev offering a way to end the crisis. Namely, the Russians would withdraw all offensive missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States would withdraw missiles from Turkey. Well, Kennedy hadn't even been aware that there were missiles in Turkey. They were obsolete missiles for which a withdrawal order had already been given because they were being replaced by invulnerable Polaris submarines. So the question was, Russia would withdraw missiles from Cuba, and in return, the U.S. would simply continue its policy of withdrawing obsolete missiles from Turkey and replacing them by much more lethal and invulnerable missiles. So what was Kennedy's reaction? He refused. A secret deal was made, but nothing was allowed to be public. Kennedy's subjective estimate at the time, as he reported, was about that there was a probability of between 1/3 and 1/2 of nuclear war, but in those circumstances, it was important to establish the principle that we have the right to surround them with lethal missiles, but of course there's no reciprocal right. Once again, the security of the population is a minor concern. That continues right to the present moment. When you investigate government decisions, foreign affairs, you routinely discover that peaceful options do exist but are dismissed, though they might well avert disaster. No time, of course, to review the record, but let's just take a look at today's headlines. So today, we're instructed that the great challenge facing the world is how to compel North Korea to freeze its nuclear and missile programs. And there are many suggestions. Perhaps we should resort to more sanctions, or cyber war, or intimidation, or an anti-missile system already installed that China realistically regards as a serious threat, or maybe even direct attack. Well, there's another possible option that seems to be ignored. The option is to accept North Korea's offer to do exactly what we're demanding. China and North Korea have offered to freeze North Korean nuclear and missile programs, a proposal which was rejected at once by Washington, exactly as it had been 2 years ago by Obama. And the reason for the instant rejection is that the Chinese North Korean proposal to do exactly what we demand has a quid pro quo. It calls on the United States to call off its threatening military exercises on North Korea's borders, which include simulated nuclear bombing attacks by B-52s sent by Trump in one of the famous signals. Well, the Chinese North Korean proposal is hardly unreasonable. North Koreans, of course, remember that their country was literally flattened by U.S. bombing. They surely have not forgotten the gleeful reports in American military journals of the bombing of major dams, a major war crime, because there just weren't any targets left. Everything else had been destroyed. And the rejoicing about the exciting spectacle of huge floods of water wiping out the rice crops on which Asians depend for survival. Actually, all of this is very much worth reading if you haven't done so. It's a useful part of historical memory. Well, the Chinese North Korean proposal could lay the basis for more far-reaching negotiations to radically reduce the threats, perhaps even bring the crisis to an end. And contrary to much inflamed commentary, there are reasons to think that negotiations might succeed. The record, which is well known to scholarship, clearly reveals that. And in fact, the North Korean regime is rather like the Russians in the 50s, is seriously intent on economic and social development. Nevertheless, despite all of this, the Chinese North Korean proposal to do what we demand, to freeze North Koreans' nuclear and missile programs in return for an end to the threats of destruction, that's inaccessible to Washington, inaccessible to commentators with quite impressive unanimity, even though the North Korean systems, nuclear and missile systems, are constantly described as the greatest threat that we face. So again, that's a matter that suggests some reflection about the state of democracy and what it implies about the prospects for survival, and also about the thesis of the nature of security in policy planning, which I mentioned earlier. Well, let's look further into how we're carrying forward our verification of Meyer's thesis. Last March, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists published a detailed report on the vast nuclear modernization program initiated by Obama, now being carried forward under Trump. The report discusses how U.S. nuclear force modernization is undermining the strategic stability on which survival depends by a slender thread. I'll quote them. The current modernization programs include revolutionary new technologies that will vastly increase the targeting capability of the U.S. ballistic missile arsenal. This increase in capability is astonishing, boosting the overall killing power of existing U.S. ballistic missile forces by a factor of roughly 3, and it creates exactly what one would expect to see if a nuclear-armed state were planning to have the capacity to fight and win a nuclear war by disarming enemies with a surprise first strike. Well, all of this, they go on to say, has revolutionary impact on military capabilities and important implications for global security. And the implications are very clear. Russian strategic analysts are, of course, aware that the United States, thanks to these modernization programs, now has the capacity to wipe out their deterrent. The Russians are way behind us in technology. They don't have our sophisticated satellite-based advanced warning systems. And with their deterrent at serious, which means just moments to make a decision, and with the deterrent at serious risk because of the nuclear modernization programs, at a moment of crisis, and there are many possibilities, Russian leaders might well be tempted to undertake a preemptive strike just to assure survival, an act which would end organized human life on Earth. Well, once again, is a diplomatic avenue possible? Surely seems so. Is it being pursued? Well, you can look into it. If it is, it's not detectable. All very relevant to Meyer's thesis. Well, turning to the second existential threat, global warming, anyone who's not living under a rock should be aware that the dangers are severe and imminent. So how are we reacting? Here's a recent report from the U.S. business press, Bloomberg Business Week. The oil boom is back. The number of oil and gas rigs drilling in the United States has almost doubled since bottoming out at the lowest level in more than 75 years of records. While 24 nations are coordinating to cut oil production and rein in the global supply glut, U.S. producers are moving in the opposite direction. Over the last 4 months, output increased by 500,000 barrels a day. If that rate of expansion continues, the shale boom will break new production records by summer. The United States now produces 9 million barrels a day. Well, that illustrates a crucial fact of current history. The world is taking halting steps towards facing the existential challenge to decent survival. Meanwhile, the richest and most powerful country in world history, the leader of the free world, virtually alone, is racing towards destruction and doing so with enthusiasm and dedication. That's been true since November 8th, 2016, another date of great historical importance. On that date, there were 3 significant events, one of them important, one extremely important, and the third astonishing. The one that was important was the election of Donald Trump, the one that received all the attention. The one that was extremely important took place in Morocco, in Marrakesh, where some 200 nations were meeting to try to carry forward the Paris negotiations of a year earlier. The Paris negotiations, recall, December 2015, intended to reach a verifiable treaty, but they couldn't do so because there was one barrier, the Republican Party. the U.S. Republican Party refused to accept any binding commissions, meaning Congress wouldn't accept it, so there couldn't be a treaty. It was left with promises. The Marrakesh meeting was an attempt to try to carry this forward and reach verifiable goals. Well, on November 8th, before the election returns came in, the World Meteorological Organization issued its report on the world situation. Its words, it confirms that 2016 was the warmest year on record, a remarkable 1.1 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial period, sharply above the previous record set in 2015, approaching the desired limit set in Paris. And there were other dire reports. Then the deliberations ended. The news came in about the American election, and the considerations at Marrakesh turned to, can we survive? Is there somebody who will lead the way now that the leader of the free world is bent on bringing about environmental catastrophe as quickly as possible? And the conclusion was that the savior might be China. So here's the spectacle. The leader of the free world is departing from the world and racing towards disaster, and the world is looking to China as a savior. Then comes the third event, the astonishing event, namely the reaction to all of this, total silence. Check and see. Practically every issue of science journals provides more grim forecasts. So there's one recent paper in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics by the prominent climate scientist James Hansen and 18 co-contributors. They compare today's climate with that of 120,000 years ago, which had slightly warmer temperatures than today and had a sea level rise of 20 to 30 feet when much of polar ice disintegrated. The paper predicts that in the near future, killer storms will have killer storms stronger than any in modern times, disintegration of large parts of the polar ice sheets, leading to melting of huge glaciers. This is taking place all over, especially in the Antarctic, and a rise of sea level sufficient to begin drowning the world's coastal cities before the end of this century. And Hansen concludes that we're in danger of handing young people a situation that's out of their control. There's a study by researchers here at the University of Bristol, published in Nature Geosciences, which found that the rate of environmental change is faster now than at any previous time in Earth's history, possibly as much as 1,000 times faster. Last year, atmospheric CO2 passed the symbolic level of 400 particles per million. That's been considered a crucial danger point. That's the first time that's happened in 4 million years, and it's probably irreversible. Well, that's only a small sample of many such reports. They appear regularly in science journals, sometimes making it to the major media. Meanwhile, the Republican wrecking ball is systematically dismantling the structures that offer hope for decent survival. The Environmental Protection Agency, established by Richard Nixon, in many ways the last liberal president in the United States, that's being virtually dismantled, and that's getting some attention. But far more important, and getting very little attention, is the Department of Energy. That's where most of the climate-related work goes on. It has an Office of Science, which is scheduled under the new Republican budget to lose 20% of its budget, almost $1 billion. The Department of Energy's $300 million ARPA energy program is eliminated completely. This is along with deep cuts in the EPA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a 5% cut in NASA's Earth Science budget. And even mention of climate change is coming under a ban. while regulations are being dismantled, and every effort is being made to maximize the use of fossil fuels, including the most destructive, like coal. And though Trump is the symbol, it's not just Trump. This is the entire Republican leadership. Those of you who followed the primaries, Republican primaries last fall, may have noticed that every single candidate, without exception, either denied that climate change is happening, or else you had the so-called moderates like Jeb Bush and John Kasich, who said, well, maybe it's happening, we don't know, but we shouldn't do anything about it. So that's 100% unanimity among the leadership saying, let's race to destruction. Incidentally, virtually no comment in the media. Comment was almost totally devoted to Trump's various outrageous statements. This was far more significant. This is not just at the national level. There's no time to go through it, but at the local level in states, the things that Republican legislatures are doing are hair-raising. But there's virtual unanimity in the party leadership. Some time ago, I made the outrageous comment that today's Republican Party in the United States is the most dangerous organization in world history. And when I made it, I stressed that it was outrageous, as it is, but raised the further question, is it true? Well, I'll leave it to you. Has there ever been an organization in world history that is so publicly and openly dedicated to massive destruction, huge destruction, on such an incredible scale? You might think about it. Well, even sea level rise, much more limited than what's anticipated, will inundate coastal cities and coastal plains, as, for example, in Bangladesh, leading maybe in the near future to tens of millions of people fleeing from the rising sea. Today, many more later, today's refugee crisis will look like a tea party. The chief environmental scientist in Bangladesh said recently that these migrants should have the right to move to the countries from which all these greenhouse gases are coming. Millions should be able to go to the United States, which just fits the current mood in the West, not just the United States, which is extreme, or Britain. And those who think it's better on the continent can turn to a recent poll which showed that a majority of Europeans want a total ban on immigration from Muslim-majority countries, far more extreme than Trump's current proposal. In general, the idea seems to be that first we destroy them, and then we punish them from trying to escape from the ruins. And we call it a refugee crisis, while thousands drown in the Mediterranean fleeing from Africa, where Europe, after all, has a certain history. In fact, the refugee crisis altogether, I think, should be regarded as a serious moral, cultural crisis in the West. Well, let's return to the other sledgehammer, the nuclear threat. The major nuclear powers, United States and Russia, are now expanding arsenals, both of them, and in quite dangerous ways. That includes tactical nukes that can be scaled down to battlefield use with very likely rapid escalation, meaning terminal disaster. And there are flashpoints all over the place. They're becoming more serious, particularly on the Russian border. Notice on the Russian border and not on the Mexican border. That's a result of the expansion of NATO right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which happened to be in violation of verbal promises to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. Now, that was the phrase that was used to Gorbachev, meaning East Germany. Nobody openly, at least, contemplated anything further. So NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, to East Germany, if Gorbachev agreed to unification of Germany within a hostile military alliance, which is a pretty remarkable concession in the light of the history of the preceding half century. There's recent archival work. It was published in the MIT-Harvard Journal, International Security, which very strongly suggests that President Bush #1 and his Secretary of State, James Baker, were consciously deceiving Gorbachev. Important fact worth looking at. Gorbachev's vision of a European common home, a security system from Brussels to Vladivostok with no military alliance, that's a fading dream. George Kennan and other senior statesmen had warned early on that NATO expansion is what Kennan called a tragic mistake, a policy error of historic proportions. It's now leading to rising tensions on the traditional invasion route through which Russia was virtually destroyed twice during the past century by Germany alone. And to make matters worse, in 2008, NATO membership was offered to Ukraine, right in the Russian geostrategic heartland, efforts that were then pursued further by Obama and Hillary Clinton. With some justice, European historian Richard Sakwa writes that NATO's prime concern now is to manage the risks created by its existence, all of which bears on Ernst Mayer's conclusion. Well, let me turn finally to the main line of defense, functioning democracy, the third part of this pincers movement that we've constructed in our effort to create a perfect storm. So we can begin with the leader of the free world again. It's been the model of democracy for centuries, although we might remember that Alexander Hamilton regarded the British system as superior to what he and his colleagues were constructing, and several million slaves might have agreed, not to speak of Native Americans. Well, let's ask what would happen in the United States if the voice of the people were heard. One possibility is that the person who is by far the most popular and respected political figure in the country would have an influential role, maybe be quoted by the media, maybe even be president. That's Bernie Sanders by a very large margin. So we learn from a poll by Murdoch's Fox News. And in fact, the Sanders campaign was the most remarkable feature of the 2016 elections, much more so than Trump's election. The election of a billionaire is not news. But Sanders' campaign broke a prevailing pattern of over a century of U.S. political history. There's quite a substantial body of academic political science research which establishes very convincingly that elections are pretty much bought. In fact, campaign funding alone, that one variable, campaign funding, is a remarkably good predictor of electability for Congress as well, and also for decisions of elected officials. And research also shows that a considerable majority of the electorate, those lower on the income scale, are effectively disenfranchised in that their representatives pay no attention to their preferences. Policies are pretty much set right at the top. The Sanders campaign broke from that very well-established model, very well-established. You go back to 1895. There was a great famous campaign manager, Mark Hanna. He was asked once, what does it take to run a successful political campaign? And he said, there are two things. The first one is money, and I've forgotten what the second one is. That was 1895, long before Citizens United, anything that opened the floods, and that's the way it's been. But the Sanders campaign broke from that well-established model. Sanders himself was scarcely known. He had essentially no support from the main funding sources, the corporate sector and private wealth. He was derided by the media, and he even used a scare word, socialist. which meant basically New Dealer. And he probably would have won the Democratic nomination if it hadn't been for the shenanigans of the Obama-Clinton party managers. Well, in the United States, as in Europe, the basic fact of the recent era, the neoliberal era, is that populations would never vote for the policies that are designed by elites, particularly those instituted during the neoliberal era of the past generation. And one consequence we see all over the place, anger, frustration, contempt for the formal institutions of democracy, often taking very ominous forms. And some simple figures give a good indication of why this is happening. So take, say, the United States, which has suffered less from these policies than most. In 2007, right before the crash, you may recall that was at the height of euphoria about the grand triumphs of neoliberalism, neoclassical economics, the Great Moderation, much enthusiasm. At that point, this is right before the crash, real wages of American workers were lower than they had been in 1979 when the neoliberal experiment was just taking off. Median wealth in the United States now is lower than it was in the early 80s. Primary reason for this was explained by Chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, when he testified to Congress on the wondrous economy he was managing. He informed Congress that what he called greater worker insecurity is keeping wages low and inflation low. That is, as he discussed, workers are too intimidated to ask for decent wages, benefits, working conditions, which is a sign of the health of the economy by some standards. Social justice measures also deteriorated through this period throughout the West, but profits are booming, particularly in the largely predatory financial industry, which exploded during the neoliberal period, accounting for 40% of corporate profit right before the crash, for which they were, again, responsible largely. One motive for the neoliberal reforms, as they're called, was to reverse a falling rate of profit that was a consequence of popular activism and labor militancy in the 60s. And that was achieved. So in one sense, at least, the neoliberal reforms are a success apart from the population. And under such conditions, democracy can hardly be tolerated. Well, much the same has been true of continental Europe under the lash of the neoliberal austerity programs, which even IMF economists have recognized are unwarranted and make no economic sense. That's the IMF economists. The IMF bureaucrats, they listen to different voices, mostly those of the rich northern banks. And those are the voices that control the unelected troika that determines policy, the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission, unelected. Now, there's a very careful and revealing investigation of the political agenda guiding these destructive economic policies by economist Mark Weisbrod. He did something interesting. He studied the reports of the regular IMF consultations with member governments of the European Union. He's published this. And he discovered, I'll quote him, a remarkably consistent and disturbing pattern. The financial crisis, 2007-2008, was exploited as an opportunity to lock in the neoliberal reforms, spending cuts in the public sector rather than tax increases, reduced benefits and public services, cuts in health care, undermining of collective bargaining, and in general, moving to create a society with less bargaining power for labor, lower wages, more inequality and poverty, a smaller government and social safety nets, and measures to reduce growth and employment. the IMF papers, he goes on, detail the agenda of Europe's decision makers, and they've accomplished quite a bit of it over the past 5 years. It's an agenda that's quite familiar here too, and in the United States, and in fact wherever the neoliberal assault has proceeded. Well, the public response in Europe to the neoliberal assault on democracy resembles what's been happening in the United States. Centrist political institutions are discredited. We saw this again in France the other day. There's public disillusionment, fear, anger running high, sometimes taking quite ominous forms. Those who are old enough to remember the 1930s, as I am in fact, cannot fail to be alarmed by the rise of neo-fascist parties, even in Austria and Germany, of all places, and not only there. And bitter memories are not easy to suppress when a majority of Europeans, as I mentioned, call for banning all Muslims from Europe, and many, here too, want to reverse the real achievements of the European Union, such as free movement of populations and erosion of national borders, which would be quite consistent with strengthening of cultural diversity in liberal and humane societies. Well, we can't attribute all of these developments across the West to the neoliberal assault, but it is a common and I think significant factor. And there's also no guarantee that functioning democracy with an informed and engaged population would lead to policies that address human needs and concerns, including the concern for survival, not trivial in the post-war period. But that's our only hope, and it's a hope that can and must be realized, which brings us back to Ernst Mayer's question again: is it better to be smart or stupid? A question for you to ponder, and like it or not, for you to answer, and without too much of a delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I've got time just to ask you one or two questions, and I suppose, given that analysis of those great global threats that we face, are you still an optimist?
Well, there are things to be optimistic that provide optimism, including some that I mentioned. So take the United States again. I think it's the Sanders campaign, I think, is a source of great optimism. It's kind of ignored, but it's not insignificant. In fact, it is very significant that this broke a pattern of over a century of essentially bought elections bought by wealth and power. And it's pretty remarkable that an unknown person with no support from the major concentrations of wealth, corporations and private wealth, is by far the most popular political figure in the United States, as we know, thanks to Rupert Murdoch. And these numbers are even higher among the young. Among younger people, the future, the population that will have to deal with this is way in the lead, far above anyone else. I think that's a reason for optimism. We might ask why there's no discussion of it. It's a very important fact, and and there's plenty of flaws in Sanders' positions. I respect him. I think he's doing important things. There are lots of things I don't agree with. I'm not saying in fact, if you take a look at it, the policies he's proposing, it would not have surprised Dwight Eisenhower very much, literally. That's an indication of where we've gone in the last 50 years. But they're very positive programs. I think there are similar things here. But I think those are signs of optimism.
So why did so many millions of your fellow American citizens vote for Donald Trump?
Actually, you can ask another question. Why did so many of them vote for Bernie Sanders, who would probably have won the Democratic nomination and might well have won the election if it hadn't been for the machinations of party managers, the Obama-Clinton party managers? So why did they do it? Well, I think there's been careful analysis of the reasons, very careful study, and it's interesting. If you take a look at the Trump voters, there are several different segments. One interesting segment is blue-collar workers who voted for Obama. They voted for Obama in 2008, believing the rhetoric of hope and change, which you may recall, and they were pretty quickly disillusioned. There was no hope, there was no change, just more bankers, corporate support for the financial institutions, which came out richer and more powerful from the crisis that they created than before. There were some positive steps, wasn't all negative, but it was nothing like what was offered to working class people. And by 2010, they were already turning against it. That's one segment. Another segment which cannot be ignored is simply white supremacists. White supremacy is a very deeply rooted factor in the United States. If you take a look at American politics since there are comparative studies of white supremacy. George Frederickson is one who's done them. By any measure, white supremacy in the United States is a more powerful factor than anywhere else in the world, including apartheid South Africa, one of the comparisons he carried out. And it is very deeply rooted. The U.S. had miscegenation laws, anti-miscegenation laws in my lifetime. And this has not disappeared, even though the laws have disappeared. It's a large segment of the society. This split the two parties in the 1960s. The civil rights movement led to the a move of Southern Democrats, which had been Southern Democrats, moved to the Republican Party. The Democrats shifted from a party that had paid some attention to the working classes to just ignoring them. So they were kind of picked up by their class enemy, the Republicans, who they vote for because there's nobody else to vote for. That's led to an extraordinary split in the United States, which has been pretty well studied. The two parties weren't very different throughout much of history. The moderate Republicans were kind of like liberal Democrats. In fact, today's liberal Democrats are sort of what used to be called moderate Republicans. That's all gone. The party distinction is a very sharp one. In fact, people in the two parties don't even intermarry. It's gotten that far. They don't talk to each other. They have different news sources. They're in different worlds, And that's led to it's led to the situation I described in the Republican Party, which is dedicated with passion to the interests of private power in the corporate sector, but manages to keep a constituency by other kinds of appeals. Disillusionment with democratic policies, some often very well justified among the working class, white supremacy, a residue of the 1960s shift of the parties, religious extremism. You cannot overlook the fact that the United States is one of the most extreme fundamentalist societies in the world, literally. Roughly 40% of the population expect the second coming of Jesus in their lifetimes. That's one of the reasons they don't take global warming very seriously. Who cares if Jesus is coming back? I don't think there's anything like this in any other society. about 80% or so, I forget the exact number, believe in miracles, you know. The Republicans have managed to take over with total hypocrisy. None of them believe a word of this segment of the population by throwing them some red meat now and then. You know, we'll block abortion or something like that, which the Republican leadership doesn't care about one way or another, but that's a way of keeping the evangelicals on board. Among white males, Trump won a huge amount over Clinton. A lot of that's Clinton's fault, but there are other factors which I don't have to tell you about. All of these things together have led to a pretty remarkable situation. And on the other side, there's the part that's not mentioned, that Sanders was doing the same thing. Not a billionaire, no support from any of the sources of wealth and power, extreme antagonism or disregard from the media, and particular appeal to young people, and breaking literally a century of political history.
My last question is this. Over the many decades that you've had a public profile, it's been, obviously, partly for your outstanding research in the field of linguistics, and it's also been because of your political commentary and social critiques. Have you had the right balance when you look back? Have you had the right balance in your life between your academic research and your political activism?
Well, if the world would go away, I would much prefer the academic research, which is far more interesting. I mean, the political discussion and analysis is important, but it's really superficial. It's not because of the lack of intelligence of people who work on it. We just don't understand much. What's understood about social and economic affairs is pretty thin. And there's a lot that's on the surface. So, for example, the fact that I mentioned that decision-making in the higher circles of government is not concerned, except marginally, with security of the population. That's a pretty dramatic fact. Things like what I mentioned about McGeorge Bundy's analysis of the situation in the early 50s. That's a shocking fact. And nobody knows, nobody cares. It's not deep, it's not quantum physics. It doesn't require much to discover. It just requires reading the sentence that says, nobody made any effort, even in private, to deal with the sole potential threat to the survival of the United States. What does that tell you? Especially when it's reiterated over and over and over. It's being reiterated right now in the case of North Korea and the Russian border. Well, it doesn't take profound intelligence or research or insight to discover that. It's on the surface. What takes intelligence is to suppress it. It's right there on the surface, you know? Like we demand that North Korea freeze its nuclear weapons and missile programs. One way to achieve that is to accept their offer to do it. Do you read that somewhere? I mean, does that require, higher intelligence and a postdoctoral degree? And no, it's right there. And most of it is right there. Actually, the real simple answer to your question was given by Bertrand Russell, one of the figures I really do admire. He was asked in the late 50s, I guess, why he's wasting his time going on marches for CND to try to stop nuclear destruction when he could be continuing his serious and important work on philosophy and logic. And his answer was pretty straightforward. He said, look, if I don't go on those marches, there's not going to be anybody around to look at philosophy and logic. And that's pretty much the answer, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Noam Chomsky. you want to sit down for a minute, if you want to sit down, I'm going to say one or two closing remarks. If you want to just sit down for a minute,
that's okay.
you have
I
your
like
time.
it. Thank you very much.
We're just going to do the award now. We just stand for one more minute.
Sure.
Thank you. I've now been joined again on the stage by Professor Laurie Butler of the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences to award Professor Noam Chomsky the Albert Wolters Visiting Professorship Award in recognition of his world-class contribution to linguistics. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. I'd like to go down with Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I wish you all a good evening and a safe onward journey. Good night.